Now to our very important topic of the day. We're delighted to have the Chief Executive of the AP to talk about journalists and safety. I think it makes many of us who are sitting comfortably feel very uncomfortable to understand the plight that many journalists are facing today. 2015 started with an attack and deaths of journalists in Paris in the Charlie Hebdo attack. We've seen beheadings of journalists in the Middle East, and that's just at the beginning of 2015. In the year 2014, over 60 journalists were killed while working. Several members of the FCC in recent years have died while reporting stories around the region, and it's an issue that's affecting every agency, every newspaper, and every TV station and digital operation. As Gary Pruitt and I were saying over lunch, whether you work for Reuters or whether you work for AP, this is something that we all agree on. It's a very, very difficult situation. Gary Pruitt is on a tour of Asia. He is the chief executive of the Associated Press, but trained as a lawyer and a specialist in freedom of expression and the First Amendment. We're delighted to have him come speak to us today. He will give a speech, but there'll be plenty of time for Q&A and discussion afterwards. Gary?
Thank you, Tara. I'm delighted to be here today at the FCC, and I want to thank all of you for coming today. I want to congratulate the FCC on their brilliant branding everywhere. It's very impressive. But fortunately, I didn't have to get an FCC tattoo to speak here today. But I do want to talk about an important subject for journalists and for journalist organizations around the world. We're headquartered in New York, and every time I walk to our newsroom, I pass by the AP Wall of Honor, which is not a grand or ostentatious wall. It's a relatively modest wall, but it's powerful. It has the photos of the 35 journalists who lost their lives while on assignment for AP over the course of our nearly 170 years of history. The first AP journalist killed covering the news was a guy named Mark Kellogg. He died in 1876, covering a very famous battle in American history, the Battle of Little Bighorn, where Native Americans wiped out a cavalry unit led by General Custer. Last year, we added 4 names to that list. It was as deadly as any year in AP's history. So, as you might imagine, it was a tough year for the AP staff and all of our colleagues around the world to endure that. And today, I want to talk about the growing risks that journalists face in trying to gather and report news fairly and accurately from around the world, and what can be done to reduce the risks that those journalists face. And at stake is the first-hand original reporting from trusted news sources, like many of you in this room today, that lets citizens be informed, live informed lives, make informed decisions, and hold governments and other large institutions accountable. As Tara mentioned, last year, 61 journalists were killed covering the news, according to the Committee to Protect Journalists. More than 1,000 have been killed since 1992. And with AP's global footprint, we're in more than 100 countries, and we're covering war and conflict wherever it occurs. So we're seeing this issue up close every single day. In one of the most high-profile killings last year, AP lost a Pulitzer Prize-winning photographer, Anja Niedringhaus. She was covering the Afghan election, and she was essentially assassinated when an Afghan police officer who was charged with protecting her turned his rifle on her and emptied it. He threw down the rifle and shouted out, "Allah Akbar, God is great," turned himself in, surrendered. In the course of that attack, AP special correspondent Kathy Gannon was hit 6 times, but she survived. She was critically wounded, but I'm happy to report she's recuperating and is determined to return to Pakistan and Afghanistan to continue her work. Now, And she's a brave woman who deserves. Thank you. Kathy and Anja were an awesome combination in covering Afghanistan over the years. AP takes the safety of its journalists very, very seriously. We've got a global security team that regularly visits all of our offices around the world, especially those in conflict zones, and makes sure security's up to date. We never ask journalists to cover a conflict. It's always a volunteer. No journalist goes unless he or she volunteers. And they don't go unless they're experienced or part of an experienced team. And everyone receives training in hostile environments and safety training and has the latest safety equipment and protective equipment, the latest communications equipment, and of course they have a large organization and an experienced organization in the AP standing behind them. But even when you do all of that, even if you get all that right, there's an irreducible risk that you have to deal with in these conflict zones. Last year, 2 of our staff members, videographer Simone Camilli and translator Ali Abu Afash, were killed when an unexploded missile went off in Gaza. It also blew off the leg of one of our photographers. Well, when an unexploded missile goes off, there's little you can do. So what we've seen now is, though, the nature of conflict is compounding the difficulty and the danger. It used to be that when media wore press emblazoned on their vests, or press or media was on the vehicle, it gave them a degree of protection. There was a sense that, okay, these are independent civilians, they're telling our story or the story of this conflict, we should leave them alone. But guess what? That labeling now is more likely to make them a target. So what's changed? Well, a few different things have. Extremist organizations don't need the media to get their story out. Because of social media and other techniques, they can go directly to the worldwide public. They don't need us. They don't want us. They want to tell their story in their way from start to finish, with nothing in between. And a journalist is a potential critical filter that they don't want to have around. Now, the larger world, however, needs us. They need us to get the real facts out or the complete story out, not just one side as they want to tell it. And then secondly, adding to the danger, kidnapping journalists and ransoming them has become a business model for terrorist organizations and extremist organizations. And then finally, and most perniciously, we find ourselves in this sickening situation where terrorists are killing journalists not to stop a story, but to create a story. A beheading becomes a bloody press release. So, it sounds bleak, but there are steps that we can and should take to reduce the risk that journalists face every day, and to increase the chances that those who kill them are brought to justice. Now, one immediate step that is for all media organizations around the world to follow common safety practices and principles. And that will be a very important step that we can take, that we journalistic organizations around the world can take together. Last month, AP and many other journalism organizations endorsed just such a set of guidelines. It was a new report called A Call for Global Safety Principles and Practice. And it calls for news organizations to treat freelancers just as they would treat regular employees. This is a very important issue. Freelancers, for the most part, aren't employees. They're contractors. And often, some media organizations won't treat freelancers the same way they treat their employees. That's wrong. Freelancers must be treated the same and have the same protection, have the same training, have the same equipment. And importantly, news organizations shouldn't make or accept assignments with freelancers unless they're prepared to be responsible for that freelancer's well-being and to support them. They have a moral responsibility to support them from the start of the assignment to the finish, the group said. A moral responsibility. AP wholeheartedly supports these guidelines. And that can be something that we can do. As media organizations contract, and some of them have fewer employees, there often are more freelancers. These freelancers need to have the same protections that employees have. But there are other steps that we should take too to protect journalists. Under the existing international law, the Geneva Conventions and other protocols, journalists are considered civilians in a conflict situation between states. And the most recent address on this topic was in 2013 by the United Nations. And they adopted a resolution condemning journalists. And it was great. And they underlined the obligations of nations to bring perpetrators to justice. Okay, but that framework only goes so far, because that protection for journalists depends upon the laws of each country. And it makes each nation responsible for investigating and prosecuting those who kill journalists. So it turns out that's a bit of a patchwork around the world right now. It's not terribly reliable. And at worst, it's completely ineffective. In 90% of the cases of a journalist being killed, there's no prosecution, there's no trial, there's not even an investigation. 90% of the cases. Only 4% of the killers of journalists are ever brought to justice, are ever convicted. So something's not working. Just as it's becoming more dangerous to cover the news, it's becoming less likely that their killers will be prosecuted. The nature of both war and media have changed dramatically in recent years. And it's clear that these existing protocols aren't working. They're just not enough anymore. So, AP believes that there needs to be a new international legal mechanism to protect journalists. One that makes the killing of journalists or taking them hostage a war crime. It is a war crime. One approach would be to create a new protocol under the Geneva Convention that makes the assassination of a journalist a specific war crime. Another approach would be to adapt the articles of the International Criminal Court, which deals with war crimes, to specifically cover journalists. There are various approaches in international law, but we need to look beyond individual nations in pursuing the killers of journalists. It needs to be something that we as an international community agree on. You know, at least when Anja Niedringhaus was killed, our photographer, the police officer who murdered her was brought to trial. Originally, he was sentenced to death. He appealed, and his sentence was just finally confirmed on Saturday, 2 days ago. And his sentence was changed to 20 years. There's solace in knowing that there was justice done in that case, and we're grateful for that. But, you know, look, I'm not naive. I do understand that many extremist groups ignore international law routinely right now, and making the killing of journalists or targeting them a war crime is not likely to change their behavior. I get that. However, there are many places and circumstances where it will have a beneficial effect, especially over time, and especially when it comes to prosecuting the killers. Because the single most treacherous threat that journalists face is having them killed with impunity. Because impunity for those who kill journalists just empowers them and emboldens them and makes it more dangerous for all journalists. AP believes that international actions must be taken to assure that those who kill journalists are brought to justice. Look, journalists who cover conflict zones are going to the most dangerous places in the world, and they're covering them so people like me and you and others can know what's going on in those dangerous places, so we can understand what are often the most important stories in the world. So the growing challenges to journalists' ability to gather news should be a worldwide cause for concern. When independent media cannot provide original first-hand reporting, freedom suffers. And a free press is the most powerful bulwark against tyranny. We must never forget that. Thank you very much.
Gary, thanks very much. We have plenty of time for Q&A. If you want to raise your hand, give us your name and organization if you'd like to, and we'll start right here with Edith. Microphone's coming around.
Hi, I'm Edith Terry, formerly of Business Week and the Globe and Mail and the SCMP here. I have a longtime colleague, John Burns, who just retired, and the deputy executive editor of the New York Times, Susan Shira, wrote a long, beautiful article. Among the things that she mentions is that John had to really push hard with the New York Times to get adequate protection for his bureau in Kabul. One of the things he got was his own security detail. It's, from the sound of it, you've got a visiting team of experts who sort of check the apparatus, but in some locations, it sounded as though some organizations at least are willing to go the extra mile.
Yes, I don't know the details, obviously, of that situation. I can tell you that we take it very seriously, and it's often a balancing act when what we have found is the journalists often are gung-ho, right? They want to go. It's mission-driven to them, and they want to go out and cover the news. And it's often the editors that have to restrain them and have to strike the balance of getting this story and trying to keep our journalists safe. But in terms of protecting the office and making sure the bureau is secure, we're all on the same page. And we should all be together on that and making sure they stay safe. As I said, there's an irreducible risk when you're in a conflict zone, but we try to make sure our offices are secure, and we do have a global security team that visits them to try to ensure that. It's never 100%, but you need to take every step you can. And if you don't, you can't sleep at night, and you can't put people at risk that way.
Thank you so much for the remarks. My name is Lara Satrakian. I'm formerly with ABC News and Bloomberg Television. I covered a number of conflict zones and now run a digital platform called News Deeply, where we work with lots of folks in various countries. And my question is essentially whether you could speak a bit about the hard calls you've had to make on what to air and what not to air, what to show, what not to show, from organizations that put journalists at risk.
Right. So AP deals with this issue regularly. And most recently and most topically here, the beheadings of journalists. When Islamic State released on social media the beheadings of journalists and non-journalists. And we have to evaluate what we put out and what we don't. And AP, and look, there are decisions to be made on this. AP decided that we would not show the beheadings. We showed the video for people to get the context of the situation, but we felt to go show all of the grisly details of that was, number one, in very poor taste, and number two, served to further the propaganda goals of the group, and that we needed to make an independent news judgment on what was valuable for people to understand. Could you see enough of the video to understand what was happening and grasp the situation without all the gory, grisly details and exploitation of human life and propaganda footage? So we used part of it, but only part of it, and not any of the bloody details. We didn't receive much criticism for that. Some people thought we should show it all, but not too much criticism. A tougher call was to whether we would show, whether we'd send out on the wire the Charlie Hebdo cartoons and depictions of Muhammad, or whether they were or not. We decided not to, and we took more criticism for that decision. Many people felt, this is a free speech issue, it should be shown. We strongly believe in free speech. I'm trained as a free speech lawyer at Berkeley, believe me. There is no place where you would more strongly believe in free speech. But there's a difference between having the right to say something and editing and making a decision about the content. AP does not seek to offend. AP seeks to report the news and inform the world and avoid offensive content. Now, people felt, given the attacks, we should stand together and those cartoons should be printed. Yeah, maybe. It was easier for those in the West to say that, I think, because if those depictions, and in the United States it was a popular cause, right? But if those depictions had been of racist cartoons with inflammatory racial slurs and showing civil rights leaders engaged in sex and issues like that and similar related issues, and there had been an attack on that organization and a killing of those organizations, I don't think some of those same people would be saying, publish those cartoons. So we decided that we should not run those cartoons, but we described them in text. And we felt that that would inform readers, but not be offensive in the broader situation. Look, there are no right or wrong calls to these issues, You've got to try to apply your similar values consistently and know that that's what they're getting. And we hope our subscribers know what they're getting with AP in that regard. AP strongly fights for free expression rights and free press rights, but we do make editorial decisions, and those are often very difficult calls. There's a couple examples.
Right over here.
Hi, Mr. Pruitt. My name is Prashant Rao. I work for AFP, and until last summer, I was AFP's Baghdad bureau chief. I wonder, AFP has a similar sort of situation to AP in that it's not just that decisions need to be made on the ground, but that there is a multimedia news team, and it's not just text journalists, but also photo and video who physically need to be there and need to see what's happening to get the kind of content that our news service provides to the people who need it. Can you talk a little bit about those two factors that, obviously you can talk about principles and you can talk about guidelines, but when it comes to decisions needing to be made on the ground in places like rebel-held Syria or parts of Iraq, increasingly in Yemen, to get not just the news but the multimedia coverage, how do you sort of parse between the journalistic requirements and the security principles that you've outlined?
Yeah, those are the very most difficult decisions to make, and the ones where you can second guess yourself both ways. And what we found is, we often thought, okay, let's send in teams together, photos, video journalists and text journalists together. And sometimes that worked, and it helped to have everyone together with communications, etc. But often the journalistic imperatives on the video side were different than text. And the storytelling was different, and capturing it was different, and text was developing sources over time. Video was getting direct video, importantly, as you said, right, kind of the eyewitness accounts. So we often had to split them up, and because there were different goals and different news gathering approaches. And but the decisions about their safety and the importance of the story versus the risk to the journalists required the same balancing act. And you mentioned rebel-held Syria. AP had, reporters in rebel-held Syria and Damascus in all of the early phases of the Syrian civil war. We're not, for the most part, in rebel-controlled Syria anymore. We're not having as many reporters there going back and forth across the Turkey border. It's just too dangerous. And so, look, that's a case where the Islamic State group has pretty much succeeded in silencing the media in reporting, because it's hard to send reporters there because they're at grave risk of being killed or captured. And you've got to take that into account. These are people's lives in the balance. And so you see then that they are achieving their goal of being able to get their message out in an unfiltered way, in an unanalyzed way. And so there's no formula for those decisions. And I can't be more specific here, but we have experienced people. I'm not making those calls. It's the editors making those calls who have experience in the region, talking to our people in the region, and it's not a bunch of expats, those are locals too, and giving us feedback as to what the story is, what the potential story is, what the risk is, what we can do, how we can be safe, and then judging and weighing those. And it's often not an easy call, because, as I said, those are often the most important stories, but they're often the most dangerous. And so those are momentous decisions, and you've got to make them day after day after day after day. The Syrian civil war has been going on for 4 years. That conflict has changed in terms of its danger and where you can be and how the coverage has gone. But it has become more dangerous for journalists. And as a result, you're seeing far less coverage from rebel-controlled Syria. I wish I could be more specific, except I do think really what it involves is having knowledgeable people from the region on the ground making sound judgment, and all of the discussion coming together as a group and making that decision. While I'm aware of it and I participate at times, I'm not the best one to judge it. I'm sitting in an office in New York City. I'm not in the best position. I tell you, I have a photo in my office of one of our photographers from the Vietnam War who was killed, as a reminder to me every day that as I sit there, what's going on out in the field and what our journalists are risking every day. So it's a reminder of how we can, strike that balance best.
Just quickly, you mentioned the idea of making it a war crime to kill journalists. What's the avenue for pursuing that? How long would it take, and what sort of support do you need to get that done?
Right. So, when you talk about a war crime, it's not like, when you're talking about a country, there's usually a very clear formula of how to create a law. Here's how a law is created in Russia, or here's how it's done in the UK, or here's the way it's done in Brazil. It's usually in a constitution, it's laid out. International law is not like that. There can be resolutions in the UN, but when you look up what's a war crime and how international law evolves, it's a various treaties and conventions and protocols over time that together forms the framework of international law and war crimes. So there are certain landmarks in terms of war crimes, and the Geneva Conventions and Geneva Accords were one, and the International Criminal Court's another that I mentioned. So what it requires is the international community coming together. What it requires is a Herculean effort. It's a very difficult task to get the international community together, virtually all the world's nations, but as many as you can get, to sign a protocol and agreement agreeing on what should be a specific war crime. It's happened in the past. There are rules of warfare. It used to be easier to agree on them, but there are specific rules of warfare. I know that sounds crazy, but there are. Look, medical staff with the Red Crescent or Red Cross can't be targeted. That's a war crime. So what we're talking about is giving journalists that similar kind of protection, that they're there to provide the eyes and the ears of the rest of us who can't be there. And now what we found is that the mechanism that we relied on for years, individual countries to prosecute them, has broken down. It's not happening. So we as an international community need to get together because this is so important. This is the way the world stays informed. And unless we can protect these journalists better, we're not going to be informed. And we're less informed, we're all in trouble. And so that is the reason we need to do it. So, do doctors and nurses get killed? Yes, they do. It doesn't prevent them from being killed. And making it a war crime won't prevent journalists from being killed. But I do think over time it can enter the consciousness. There is an idea that you don't attack medical personnel. Sometimes they still get attacked. But for them, they have more protection, I would venture to say, than journalists do. And their attacks, I think, have more likelihood of being prosecuted. I don't know the statistics on that. But I think that journalists deserve that kind of protection. It's a difficult process, it's a long process, and it's like building international consensus to have one of these conventions and to work it out. But it's these sort of conventions and protocols that prevent the use of chemical weapons and biological weapons and torture and targeting medical personnel. And it should prevent the targeting of journalists as well.
Questions on this side of the room, over here?
Yeah, I had a question following up on what you were saying. You mentioned the conventions are geared towards states, but do they apply or can they apply to groups like ISIS or Al-Qaeda? Or, I mean, how do you get a lot of states to sign up, but they're non-state entities?
That's exactly right. So there will be lawless territories. There will be outlaws, no matter what the law is. There will be outliers. That will never go away. And that's what I said. That's always going to be the case. But I think making it a war crime increases the chances of prosecution after the fact. When it's not a war crime, I think the chances of prosecution are much less because you're relying on the nation state that may not have an interest in doing it, may not have the capability of doing it. So I think having an international mechanism to follow up, just as there are the International Criminal Court following up on the Bosnian Serb war, looking at genocide, looking at war crimes there, you could have that sort of thing going on as lawless actors have targeted journalists after the fact. That can't go on now. That just doesn't go on. I know civilians being targeted can be a crime and that can be targeted as part of it, but I think it would help if it were more specific. You're certainly right. There are going to be places where it just doesn't matter and that they will carry on as they want to, and that's part of, unfortunately, that's part of life. But I do think over time, building a consensus and awareness that journalists deserve protection the way, say, medical staff does, can enter the consciousness of the world community and help. And prosecution following up can help, so that there's less impunity to targeting and killing journalists.
We have a question on the veranda.
Yes, hi, I'm Per Liljas, a stringer with a Swedish newspaper, and I've been working as a freelancer for a long time. So I was interested in you developing a little bit about what you said about newspapers and bureaus taking the same sort of responsibility for their freelancers as their workers, their employees. How do you concretely go about to do that? I mean, many times a freelancer has already done a work or is about to head out to a place, to the field to do some work, and they're pitching a story. How do you get in safety training, for instance?
Right.
And stuff like that. How
Yes.
do you do?
Well, if the work has already been done by a freelancer and the freelancer is trying to, pitch his or her work or sell his or her work, it's already been done. You're right. At that point, it's a fait accompli. But if, in many cases, freelancers are looking to for a contract or a sponsor or help in developing a story or going into a place. And media organizations may have less staff than they've had in the past, and they may be interested in that. And that may be a perfectly fine way of going about it. I don't have any problem with that. We don't have any problem with that. Our point is, don't think that because you've engaged in a freelance contract, your obligations to that individual are any less. You have the same moral responsibility to that person that you have to your own employees. That you must make sure that person has training, has equipment, can protect him or himself as best possible, and not put them in too dangerous a situation. And then importantly, if something bad happens, that you stand behind them, that you don't abdicate. If that person gets taken hostage, they need that media organization to help them out and to stand behind them. And if they abdicate, that's a terrible situation, and that person's alone in the world. And so I think it's, and I will tell you that a large number of media organizations have agreed to this. This is not AP alone. Reuters, AFP, the large agencies and media organizations around the world, hopeful that there will be enough peer pressure that these will be the guidelines adopted by media companies worldwide, that we live up to this. Because given the retrenchment of traditional media, there are fewer journalists as employees, but more freelancers. So we've got to step up to this issue and make sure that freelancers have those protections that employees have. We can't have a two-class system here. This is too important. This stuff's too important. Everyone's got to be treated similarly. So we're trying to get those same protections and guidelines. If the freelancer's done the work, that's done. But if he or she is making a pitch and trying to get a media organization to support him or her doing some work, fine, that's okay. But let's have that media organization treat that freelancer like an employee and stand behind them every step of the way.
We have a question right behind the cameras there on the veranda.
Hi, my name's Adam Martin. I'm with the SCMP. I was wondering if the AP would like to see any extra protections for journalists in the United States along the same lines as the notion of a war crime, of harming a journalist being a war crime internationally. I'm thinking of a few instances over the last few years where photographers were arrested or possibly attacked covering protests, such as in New York. And I think the AP was actually a signatory to a complaint letter to the NYPD. I'm wondering in the future, would you like to see any kind of laws changed or policies changed, or what would be the sort of parallel, I guess, domestically?
Yeah, so AP is based in the United States. AP is completely independent of the US government. We're a nonprofit cooperative. We have more fights with the US government than any other government. So yes, when a law is an international law, it applies to every country and around the world. And so it would apply with equal force to the United States as any other country, and in the country or outside.
Florence, please.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm Florence de Changy. I report for Le Monde and also for Radio France Internationale, which actually has had more than its share in terms of killed journalists in the field. I was wondering, because you mentioned a before and a now. A before, when the press vest was still some kind of guarantee that you would be avoided by the sniper or whoever. When do you see this change happening in the last few years? Is it from Afghanistan? Is there specific conflicts where we've seen the rules change?
I think you might know better than I. I think we've seen that change occur over the past generation. I think it began to change in the 90s and come in full force in the last decade in the Middle East. But I think it may have begun in the Bosnian Serb War and the early 90s. And I'm sure it had antecedents before that. So I'm not an expert on that whole history, but it does seem to me that it began shifting in the 90s. This is one of the advantages of being as old as I am. And then, one of the few, by the way. And then what's happened in the past 15 years or 20 years in the Middle East, I think, has brought it into full force. And now with, and I'm afraid it's the new norm for journalists around the world. We will see. The nature of conflict has changed. So often these international war crimes dealt with two states battling, you know, and it can be somewhat outdated now. That whole concept of seemed to have a World War II kind of model to it. But now it's a different sort of conflict, and a different sort of international law needs to be applied, I believe.
Did you mean the new norm for journalists to be targets, right?
Yeah,
Is that what you said?
I do. I do. Sadly, not in every case, but I think that you know, when our journalists are going into these dangerous zones in the Middle East, they are not advertising that they are journalists.
We have time for one more question.
Hey there, my name's Daniel Simmons, and I'm with CNN here in Hong Kong. My question really was reflecting back on the guidelines you mentioned for media organisations to sign up to with regards to the safety of journalists. Do you think that one very effective way of protecting journalists and ensuring that those safety guidelines are being adhered to is to refuse to air or publish anything that wasn't obtained within the bounds of a pre-agreed security arrangement or safety arrangement?
Meaning if from the freelancers or something?
Well, I just mean in general. If
in general.
you said yourself, journalists can sometimes be extremely gung-ho about what they want to do. In much the same way that we would ensure that everything that we air is editorially sound, do you not think it would be effective in ensuring that if you want your stuff to get on air, then you must have obtained that within the bounds of a pre-agreed security arrangement? Right.
Well, I'm sorry we had time for only one more question, but not the answer. No. Very serious question and a very good question. I do think that's the right approach. I do think it's the right approach. That unless they live up to those codes and that pre-existing guidelines, then that material should not be used. Thank you very much. I appreciate the serious nature of the questions and focus today. Thank you.
Gary, thanks very much for joining us today. We do have a small gift from the FCC. We're very glad you could come along, and please come back and visit us again soon. And thanks to everyone for joining today.
Thank you. Thank you very much.